In 1842, Virginia, on a sprawling plantation where the sun scorched the fields and the air carried the scent of tobacco and sweat, a young enslaved man moved quietly among the cotton and corn, his hands skilled with needle and thread, his eyes always watching, always listening. Life was measured in labor and obedience. Every word weighed and every glance calculated. The master ruled with cruelty and caprice, his voice a weapon, his presence a shadow that stretched across cabins and fields. Yet beneath this oppression, small acts of defiance took root. Whispers passed in the dark, secrets stitched into cloth, messages carried in the rhythm of work and the subtle gestures of those who dared to resist. In this world, a single act could ripple through lives and generations, and on one night, guided by courage, necessity, and a vision of justice, one man would perform an act that would silence a tyrant and echo far beyond the boundaries of the plantation, a story of rebellion, morality, and the human spirit unfolding in the quiet strength of chains and threads. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. In 1842, the Virginia sun rose heavy and unrelenting over the sprawling plantation, its warmth pressing down on the red clay paths and the fields of tobacco that stretched as far as the eye could see, the leaves thick and fragrant, their scent mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil and the sweat of those who tended it. The enslaved men and women moving with quiet precision, bending and straightening in rhythms learned over years, their murmurs carrying across the rows, a soft undercurrent beneath the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional bark of a dog patrolling the edges of the estate, the grand house perched above the fields like a watchful eye, its white pillars gleaming in the early light, a symbol of authority and dominance that cast a long shadow over everyone below. The master moving through the hallways with measured steps, his presence felt even in his absence, a weight that pressed on the workers' shoulders and kept their heads bowed. The overseers walking along the rows, their whips coiled at their sides, eyes sharp and calculating, ready to strike at the slightest sign of hesitation or faltering. In the fields, the heat clung to the skin, heavy and relentless, the sun glinting off metal tools and broken soil, the scent of tobacco mingling with sweat, smoke from morning fires, and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves underfoot, the air thick with the tension of unsaid words and hidden fears, every glance measured, every step considered, the enslaved learning to move with the land, not only to work it but to survive within its invisible chains. The songs they hummed, low and almost inaudible, carrying memories of distant places, ancestors, and moments of fleeting freedom, the rhythm of life dictated by the sun, the master, and the demands of the crops, the plantation itself, a living entity, the fields stretching endlessly, punctuated by the distant barns, the water troughs, the shaded groves that offered rare respite from the heat, the animals grazing or tethered, the chickens scratching at the ground, the horses snorting and shifting in their stalls, all part of the same system, all observed and measured. The hierarchy as natural and as harsh as the soil beneath their feet. And in that space between work and watchfulness, between sun and shadow, the people moved, spoke in whispers, carried burdens invisible to those in the house, their bodies weary but their minds alert, sensing every glance, every footfall, every change in the wind or the creak of a wagon wheel. The plantation alive with unspoken rules, tension that lingered in the air, and a weight that pressed on every shoulder, heavy, constant, inescapable. Among the rows of tobacco and corn, the young man moved with quiet precision, his fingers deft and practiced as they worked the needle through scraps of cloth and worn garments, each stitch a testament to patience and skill. The sound of thread pulling through fabric soft and almost invisible beneath the rustle of leaves and the murmurs of his fellow workers. He carried himself with a careful awareness, eyes always scanning, always measuring. For the master, the overseers, the prying eyes that might see more than they should, in his hands, simple pieces of cloth became tools of survival. Patches mended, garments repaired, messages hidden in folds and seams, a small act of resistance that went unnoticed, yet held meaning beyond the material. He exchanged a glance with another worker across the field. A silent signal. A nod almost imperceptible, a message of shared understanding. Their eyes spoke the words their lips could not. The network of whispers carried across the rows, carried in gestures, in hidden marks, in subtle shifts of body and stance. In the evening, after the day's labor, when the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, he would gather with a few trusted others, seated in a circle beneath the trees, hands busy with needle and thread, crafting, repairing, creating, the conversation low and careful, the words chosen for secrecy, stories of distant kin, memories of freedom, small plans for defiance. Every stitch and whisper a reminder that they were not wholly powerless, that even within the strictures of the plantation there was space for thought, for strategy, for humanity. In those moments he felt a quiet strength, a sense of purpose that pulsed beneath the fear and fatigue. The fabric in his hands, a metaphor for the world he could not yet change, yet still shaped in small ways. The breeze carried scents of earth and tobacco and sweat, and in that air, in the rhythm of the work and the hidden messages, the young man understood the power of silence and subtlety, the way a single glance could convey warning or encouragement, the way a carefully placed stitch could carry a message across distance and time. Every action deliberate, every motion imbued with meaning. He learned to move like the wind among the cornrows, unseen but felt, a presence that could not be fully measured, a quiet rebellion woven into the fabric of daily life. And as the day faded into evening, the network of whispers persisted, unbroken, resilient, a testament to the ingenuity and spirit of those who labored in silence and yet communicated more profoundly than words could ever express. The master walked through the plantation with measured steps, his presence felt before he was seen. The sun glinting off the white pillars of his house behind him, the weight of his authority pressing down on every field and row, his eyes sharp and calculating, scanning for any sign of hesitation, any faltering motion that might betray disobedience. He carried himself with a cold confidence, a capricious cruelty that made the workers flinch with every glance. The enslaved knew the sound of his boots on the wooden floors, the way the wind carried his voice across the fields, the snap of commands given without warning. The master's word was law, his temper unpredictable. A flicker of annoyance could turn into hours of punishment, his moods like storms that left devastation in their wake. The overseers followed closely, whips coiled in their hands, eyes alert to the slightest misstep, every instruction issued with precision, every threat felt in the air. The young men and women in the fields moved as shadows, bending to the rhythm dictated by him. Their bodies trained to obey before thinking, fear a constant companion. The master demanded perfection, silence, and unquestioning attention. He believed in control, through intimidation. In obedience enforced through pain. A glance too long, a word too loud, a hand too slow, and punishment would follow. The fields themselves seemed to shrink under his gaze, the sun harsh and hot, the soil unyielding, yet nothing as oppressive as the invisible chains of fear. He measured loyalty not in words, but in posture, in the alignment of bodies, in the quiet compliance of those who knew better than to speak or act without permission. The enslaved learned quickly that survival depended on vigilance, on reading the subtle cues, on predicting his whims before they turned into wrath. Every whispered conversation was weighed for risk, every step calculated to avoid notice. And yet, within the same system, the master's paranoia created openings, cracks where resistance could take root, fleeting moments where he turned his attention elsewhere, and in those moments, the enslaved moved with care and skill, a silent defiance that would grow over time. The power he wielded was absolute in appearance, yet fragile in its reliance on fear and the strict enforcement of order. The plantation was a theater of obedience, with him as the director. Yet even in the shadow of cruelty, the human spirit persisted, the workers carrying secrets, skills, and small acts of rebellion that whispered back against the command. And through it all, the young man observed, learned, and waited, understanding that survival required both submission and the quiet patience to act when the moment arrived. The young man moved through the fields with quiet purpose, his hands carrying the tools of a craft honed in secrecy and necessity. The needle and thread, small instruments, yet powerful in their subtlety. He worked on scraps of cloth, mending torn garments, patching shoes, repairing sacks, each stitch precise and deliberate, the motion almost meditative. His mind focused on the pattern, the tension of the thread, the shape of the tear. The enslaved around him moved with their burdens, unaware of the skill being practiced in their midst. The master never noticed, the overseers too busy with their patrols to see the delicate artistry that passed under their gaze, and yet this talent carried more weight than any tool in the fields. Each garment restored meant warmth in the cold, dignity in appearance, a small comfort that the master could not take away. Each patch and repair became a quiet act of preservation, of survival, and even rebellion. In the evenings, he would gather with others, sharing knowledge, showing how to reinforce seams, hide messages, create pockets, a network of utility and communication that moved unseen. The work transformed the ordinary into extraordinary, the needle becoming a symbol of resilience, the thread a lifeline woven between people. He understood that skill could grant influence, a subtle authority that existed beyond the master's control. The workers relied on his hands, not only for comfort but for connection. A stitched note, a hidden pouch, a repaired strap, each small gift a testament to the quiet power that could thrive in secrecy. The rhythm of stitching carried through the night, the candlelight flickering against worn faces, the scent of cloth and oil filling the small spaces. The young man's mind attentive to both craft and the world around him, learning the limits of observation, the timing of movement, the ways that skill could be shielded yet shared. Every knot tied, every hem straightened, became a lesson in patience, in discretion, in control. His hands moved with a confidence born of necessity, creating a balance between survival and subtle defiance. The master remained oblivious, the fields full of labor and noise, yet the real power quietly threaded its way through the lives of those who knew how to wield it, and in that space between fear and hope, the young man recognized that mastery of craft could become mastery of circumstance, a way to protect, to sustain, to influence. And in that realization, each stitch he placed became more than repair. It became a statement of presence, persistence, and the enduring strength of those who labored in silence. The master's voice carried across the fields, sharp and commanding, a sound that shaped the rhythm of labor and the movements of those who worked beneath him. Every word weighed with authority, every command designed to remind the enslaved of their place. Speech was controlled with precision. No question could linger, no hesitation tolerated. The workers learned quickly to respond before thinking, to anticipate the master's moods and the expectations hidden behind a glance or a tone. Whispers were dangerous. A word spoken too loudly or at the wrong time could bring punishment swift and certain. The overseers enforced the rules with rigid eyes and taut muscles, their presence a constant reminder that freedom of expression was forbidden. Even small conversations were measured for risk. Laughter was subdued, smiles careful. The simple act of speaking became a calculation, every syllable considered, every pause deliberate. The psychological weight of this control pressed on the enslaved bodies and minds. The young man watched, listened, learned, understanding that language itself was a form of power. To speak without permission was to invite pain. To remain silent was both protection and imprisonment. The mind adjusted to anticipate threats, to translate glances and gestures into meaning. The community of the enslaved found ways to communicate despite the oppression, signals hidden in work routines, messages sewn into fabric, codes embedded in rhythm and song. The tension of surveillance shaped thought, bending it toward caution, toward secrecy. Creativity became a shield, imagination a necessity. The master's control was not only of bodies but of the mind. The enslaved internalized his authority, fearing not only what he would do but what the consequences might be for any deviation. In that space, silence became both weapon and prison. The young man understood that the power of speech could be reclaimed, only carefully, strategically. Every word could carry consequence, and every act of quiet defiance, every hidden conversation, became an assertion of presence in a world designed to suppress it. The mind worked in layers, aware of who was watching, who was listening, who could be trusted. Thought itself became a battlefield. The master's power pervasive yet vulnerable to the subtle resistance carried in glances, gestures, and the hidden network of communication that threaded through the fields. The enslaved learned to speak without speaking, to act without notice, and in that quiet mastery of language and observation, they preserved both survival and dignity. The chains of speech, invisible but heavy, shaping every interaction, every choice, every heartbeat. And in that pressure, the young man discovered the value of discretion, patience, and the enduring strength that came from understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. The day began like any other, the sun climbing slowly over the fields, casting long shadows across the tobacco leaves. Yet an unease hung in the air, thick and palpable. The master appeared suddenly, his boots striking the ground with deliberate force. The overseers close behind. The young man and others paused mid-task, hands frozen over tools and plants, hearts pounding in anticipation of what might come. The master's eyes scanned the field, sharp and cold, settling on a worker whose foot had brushed against a row of corn, the slightest infraction in the master's perception. He barked an order that made the air shiver. The man stumbled in apology, words tumbling in panic, yet the master was not appeased. His hand rose, and the whip cracked through the morning air. The sound sharp and terrifying. A warning to all. The worker fell to the ground, the lashes cutting into flesh. Screams swallowed quickly by the fear that gripped everyone. The young man watched, muscles tense, chest tight, the smell of sweat and blood mingling with the earthy aroma of the fields. He saw the terror etched into faces, the silent prayers whispered under breaths. The master moved on, satisfied only with fear, yet the punishment lingered, a heavy weight on every shoulder. The young man's hands itched, not with the tools of labor, but with a desire he could not yet voice. The cruelty was a language he understood in every fiber of his body. It spoke of domination, of absolute control, of the fragility of life in this place. The fear was suffocating, yet beneath it grew a quiet ember of anger, a realization of the injustice that bound them. The hopelessness pressed like iron against the chest, yet even in despair, the young man's mind worked, observing, remembering, planning, each act of brutality a lesson in the limits of obedience, the necessity of caution, the value of skill hidden from the master's eyes. As the sun climbed higher, the overseers ensuring compliance, the workers bent and silent. The young man carried both the horror of what he had witnessed and the determination it ignited. He felt the chains of fear tighten and simultaneously loosen in the mind, where thought could still move unseen. He thought of the needle, the thread, the small powers that could be wielded in secret, the master's cruelty, a mirror reflecting the strength that would be required to survive, and perhaps one day, to resist. And in that moment, as the screams faded, and the fields returned to the rhythmic hum of labor, the young man understood that this brutality was not isolated. It was the system, a constant that would shape every decision, every movement, every stitch. And it planted in him the first seed of rebellion, a quiet resolve that whispered of justice hidden in plain sight. Waiting for the right time to emerge, the young man moved through the rows of tobacco with hands busy and mind restless, the rhythm of labor unable to quiet the storm inside him. Every lash, every cruel command replayed in his thoughts, the faces of those who had suffered under the master's whims pressing against the edges of his memory. He felt the weight of fear that had shaped his world since boyhood, yet beneath it grew a different force, a seed of defiance taking root in the soil of his mind. He wondered how long one could endure such cruelty and still bend without breaking. The master's voice echoed in his ears, sharp and relentless, a constant reminder of the chains that bound him. But the young man began to see patterns. The way the master demanded obedience, the way the overseers enforced it, the gaps where vigilance slipped, the brief moments when opportunity flickered and vanished too quickly for most to grasp. He thought of the needle and thread that had been his refuge, the skill that had earned him trust and discretion. The same hands that repaired garments could create something else, something intentional. He imagined silence as a tool, a weapon shaped not from violence but from patience and cunning, the act of withholding speech, of bending the master's expectations, of moving unseen, became a strategy in his mind. He felt the anger rise, hot and raw, yet tempered by the understanding that rashness could destroy everything. The young man measured each thought, each impulse, testing its weight and consequence. He considered how words could betray him, how even a whisper could invite punishment, and realized that in silence there was power. The ability to observe, to plan, to influence subtly without detection. The seed of defiance grew stronger as he imagined the balance of control shifting, not through confrontation yet, but through careful, deliberate action. Each decision, a small assertion of autonomy. He watched the master from a distance, studied his habits, his routines, the way he relied on fear to dominate. And in that observation, he found clarity, the knowledge that patience could outlast cruelty, that subtlety could overcome brute force. And in the quiet corners of his mind, he began to weave a vision, a plan, not yet acted upon but alive in thought, a promise to himself and to those around him that the chains of fear were not unbreakable, that silence could become shield and sword. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fields, the young man carried the weight of the day and the spark of a future that might one day bend the world toward justice, the seed of defiance taking root quietly, patiently, but with a strength that would not be denied. The young man waited until the last embers of light faded from the sky, the fields quiet except for the distant calls of nightbirds and the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. He moved carefully through the shadows, his hands clutching scraps of cloth and a small bundle of thread hidden beneath his shirt. Each step measured to avoid the patrols of the overseers, each breath shallow, controlled. The night offered cover yet also danger. Discovery would mean punishment, or worse. He found a secluded corner near the edge of the woods, the place where moonlight barely touched the ground, and there he set to work. His fingers steady despite the racing of his heart, he threaded the needle with meticulous care. The simple act made sacred in its secrecy, each stitch a small assertion of agency in a world built on fear and submission. He practiced patterns learned in whispers, techniques passed along by others who had once trusted him with similar secrets. The movement of needle through cloth became a rhythm, a meditation, a way to transform tension into control. The sound of metal puncturing fabric was almost silent in the night, yet in that quiet he felt a pulse of exhilaration, the thrill of bending circumstance, the mastery of craft becoming resistance. He knew that discovery could undo everything. The weight of consequence pressed against his shoulders, yet it sharpened his focus. He measured each stitch, tested each knot, imagined how it could serve a purpose beyond repair, each loop of thread a tiny bond connecting him to the hope of change. The young man paused to listen. The night held its breath. The distant creak of a wheel or the soft crunch of a branch could signal intrusion, but the world remained still, granting him a fragile reprieve. He worked through hours that felt like minutes, the moon tracing patterns across the cloth, shadows dancing across his hands. He thought of the master, of the fear he wielded like a weapon, and felt a quiet defiance settle in his chest. The needle and thread carried power that the overseers could never see, a means to assert control in the smallest, most intimate way. Each stitch prepared him for what lay ahead, each careful knot a lesson in patience and precision, and as dawn approached, the young man folded his work carefully, hid the cloth and thread beneath the earth near a tree. A secret cache that would sustain him in the days to come. The risk of discovery lingered like a shadow, yet in that moment he felt the satisfaction of agency, the first tangible steps toward resistance, the quiet revolution stitched in the darkness. The night had witnessed his preparation, and the young man knew that the threads he had woven would one day carry more than cloth. They would carry intention, purpose, and the courage to act when the time was right. The night fell heavy over the plantation, a blanket of darkness that swallowed the rows of tobacco and the worn paths between the cabins. The air was thick and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. The master's house stood silhouetted against the moon, its windows dark, the soft glow of lanterns extinguished. The fields lay quiet, yet alive with subtle movements. The rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the distant call of an owl. The young man moved with deliberate care, every footstep muffled against the packed soil, every breath measured, the needle and thread hidden in the folds of his clothing. The weight of the night pressing against him like a living thing, he felt the fear coil tight in his chest, a constant companion sharpened by years of obedience forced by terror. Yet beneath that fear lay the seed of anticipation, a pulse of resolve that quickened with every shadow, every corner, every chance that the master might appear or the overseers might hear. The plantation seemed alive with unseen eyes, the sway of branches casting long, dancing shadows across the ground, the wooden fences groaning softly under the wind, the cabins silent, except for the occasional shift of a sleeper. The young man paused at the edge of the yard, listening, the air heavy with the scent of sweat, smoke, and the faint tang of metal from tools left in the barn. The night deepened, enveloping everything in a velvet darkness that made shapes indistinct, sounds magnified, each heartbeat a drum counting the passage of time. He felt the tension in his hands as he clutched the cloth and thread, knowing that every movement must be precise, deliberate, every misstep a risk of discovery. The wind carried faint whispers of distant voices, perhaps imagined, perhaps real. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. The young man's mind sharpened, alert to the smallest change in sound, the faintest shift in shadow, the cool touch of air against skin. He imagined the master stirring, his silhouette crossing the veranda, the soft creak of stairs, the possibility of lantern lights sweeping the yard, and each possibility heightened the suspense. The plantation, usually full of labor and noise, now existed in suspended time, a world poised between fear and action. And in that stillness, the young man felt the weight of choice, the convergence of preparation and opportunity. The night held both danger and potential. Every rustle, every whisper, every shadow a test, and as he moved carefully through the darkness, the anticipation coiled tight with fear and determination. The moment had arrived. The plantation's silent witness to the first steps of a plan that would unfold under the cover of midnight. The young man approached the master's quarters with hands steady but heart pounding, the cloth and thread concealed carefully in his coat, every step measured to avoid the creak of floorboards or the shift of loose nails, the air heavy with the scent of waxed wood and candle smoke. The master slept in the dim glow of a single lantern, the shadows stretching long across the room, his breathing slow and deep. The young man knelt beside the bed, feeling the weight of what he was about to do press against his chest, the needle poised in his fingers, thread slipping through his fingers with practiced ease. Every movement deliberate, careful, the sound of the thread pulling through skin almost imperceptible. Yet each pass carried the weight of years of cruelty, of fear endured, of silent suffering witnessed in the fields and cabins. He worked with focus that blurred the edges of time, the rhythm of needle and thread, a meditation, a method of transforming rage and despair into precision and intent. He felt the tension coil and release with every stitch. The master stirred slightly, a murmur escaping that went unheeded. The young man's hands did not falter, his mind tracing every memory of pain inflicted and endured. The act was both punishment and protection, literal and symbolic. The sealing of lips, a declaration, a reclaiming of power denied for too long, yet beneath the surface of defiance lay complexity. A recognition of the moral weight, the life and body entrusted, forcibly and unwillingly, into his hands. He paused for a moment. Breath caught, eyes focused on the master's face. The thread taut and precise, the culmination of skill honed in secret. Years of practice and patience, and with the next series of careful stitches, the act completed. The young man leaned back slightly, chest heaving, mind racing with the gravity of what had been done, the room silent except for the faint flicker of candlelight, the symbolic resonance of the act pressed against him. A statement of autonomy in a world built on oppression, a whisperless voice that could never be silenced again in memory. He regarded the master's face, expressionless and unaware. The weight of survival, justice, and retribution mingling in the quiet, the young man understood that this moment carried consequences he could not yet measure. Yet in the act itself, there was clarity. An assertion of control long denied, a transformation of helplessness into deliberate action. The night held him in its darkness, witness to the precision, the fear, the resolve, the threads now both literal bonds and emblematic chains, a reflection of pain endured, and the courage to claim the space for thought, for defiance, for agency. The act of silence complete, yet echoing with the resonance of years of oppression and the first tremors of revolt. The master awoke with a start, the sensation of the thread tight across his lips, a shock that froze him in place. Panic rising in his chest as he struggled to speak and found only silence, the room spinning as disbelief overtook him, his eyes wide, searching for explanation, the young man standing quietly nearby, calm in contrast to the storm unfolding, the master's face flushed with a mix of fury and confusion, his hands trembling as he clawed at his own mouth. The servants and overseers rushing in at the sound of commotion, their faces mirrors of horror and uncertainty, the once unquestioned authority of the master now fractured, the plantation filled with a tense energy, the air thick with fear. The enslaved who had witnessed from the shadows felt a surge of relief and cautious hope, yet knew the danger had not vanished. The master's rage grew, hot and unpredictable. He slammed fists against furniture, overturned a chair, the sound echoing through the halls, the veneer of control slipping as he attempted to assert dominance through threats and gestures. The young man's heart raced, yet he remained composed, aware that panic was now the master's companion, that the illusion of invincibility had been pierced. Whispers moved quickly through the corridors. Eyes darted, conversations cut short. The overseers tried to re-establish order, their voices raised, commands sharp, yet they too sensed the fragility of authority, the master's voice now absent, replaced by growls and muttered curses, his vulnerability exposed for all to see. The enslaved felt the weight of centuries of oppression meet a sudden, tangible disruption. The once rigid hierarchy shaken. The young man moved silently, observing, knowing that the balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly. The plantation seemed to breathe differently. A tension that was both exhilarating and dangerous. The master's panic was a spectacle of human fragility, his anger a raw, unmasked force. The young man understood that control depended not on fear alone but on the perception of unassailable power, now cracked. He considered the threads of consequence that would ripple outward, the whispers of rebellion that might grow, the small victories that might inspire courage. Yet the danger remained omnipresent. One misstep could bring ruin. The master's attempts to restore order were frantic and scattered, the overseers enforcing discipline while fearing the unknown. The young man observed the scene with measured breathing, the awareness that silence had spoken louder than any lash, that the act had unsettled the foundations of authority. The aftermath was chaos contained within walls, the plantation alive with tension, a moment suspended between fear and the glimmer of possibility. The young man felt the weight of what had been done, the threads of defiance now tangible, the master's rage and vulnerability, a reminder that power could be challenged. The air thick with the echoes of a night that would not soon be forgotten. And in that charged atmosphere, the young man understood the fragile and fleeting nature of control, and the potential for quiet rebellion to take root. The morning sun rose over the plantation, casting long shadows across the fields. The enslaved moved cautiously through their tasks, their hands working the tobacco leaves, their eyes flicking toward the master's house, the air thick with tension, each step measured, each glance loaded with unspoken questions. Whispers passed quickly from cabin to cabin. soft voices carrying tales of the night's events. Fear mingled with awe. The young man's actions had broken the invisible rules that governed life here. Yet in that breach, a fragile sense of possibility emerged. The community sensed a shift. The master's authority, once absolute, now carried cracks that could be felt in every corner. Conversations moved to hushed tones, laughter tempered, movements deliberate. A new respect mingled with caution. Each individual weighed the consequences of curiosity, of defiance, of speaking too freely. Yet the memory of the master's vulnerability lingered like a quiet promise. The young man walked among them, careful, observant, noting the way heads tilted in recognition of courage, the subtle nods that acknowledged understanding without words. The psychological ripple spread. Some felt emboldened, hearts quickened at the thought of reclaiming small pieces of power. Others retreated inward, clinging to survival instincts honed through years of obedience and fear. The tension was palpable, a current running through the community, connecting them in shared knowledge and shared risk. Eyes met briefly across fields, a spark of recognition passing silently between workers. The act had redefined boundaries. Authority was no longer unquestioned. The young man's presence became a symbol, not of reckless rebellion, but of careful strategy. The whispers carried advice, cautions, praise, and stories that would grow in retelling. The plantation itself seemed different, the air charged with new awareness. Even the animals in the fields seemed to pause. Sensing the unusual energy, the master moved among the workers, attempts at normalcy strained, the overseers more alert, tension vibrating beneath the surface of routine. Each task accomplished carried weight, each silence now laden with meaning. The young man noticed the way glances lingered on him, the way unspoken questions hovered in the air. The psychological landscape had shifted. Fear remained, but it now walked hand in hand with respect, a subtle power balancing against the old order. He understood that influence could be wielded quietly, without confrontation. The community responded in ways small and significant, their lives intertwined with this new dynamic. The plantation was no longer simply a site of labor and oppression. It had become a space where courage, calculation, and observation could alter the rhythm of existence, and as the sun climbed higher, casting light on the fields and cabins, the young man felt the weight and the promise of what had begun, the threads of defiance now weaving through the hearts and minds of those who had once only obeyed. The young man learned early that the world he lived in was governed not by fairness or mercy but by laws designed to control, to bind, and to punish. The slave codes of Virginia in 1842 were written in ink but enforced in flesh, each line a chain that held the enslaved in place. The codes dictated every aspect of life, from the labor required in the fields to the movement allowed beyond the plantation, from the voices that could be raised to the bodies that could be punished. The punishments were swift and severe: whippings, shackles, fines, and sometimes death, all meted out with the assurance that the law was absolute. The young man saw how these rules stripped humanity from the enslaved, reducing men and women to property, denying them the simplest protections, denying them recourse, denying them justice. Courts existed, but they served only to uphold the interests of masters. Complaints by the enslaved were unheard, evidence dismissed, witnesses ignored, a system designed to maintain control, to make obedience seem natural, inevitable. The law itself was a tool of oppression, yet it carried a veneer of legitimacy. The plantation overseers wielded it like a sword, knowing every word could be twisted, every action framed as transgression. The enslaved learned to read the invisible rules, to navigate a world where misstep meant pain. Yet the young man saw the cracks, the spaces where cunning, silence, and skill could create agency. The law could bind the body but not the mind, could dictate actions but not intent. The slave codes demanded that marriages between enslaved people were not recognized, that children belonged to the master, that movement without permission was a crime, that education, learning to read or write, could be punished by brutality. These codes created fear, but also a shared understanding among the enslaved. The young man absorbed these lessons, knowing that any defiance must be measured, that resistance was a dangerous calculus, that even small acts carried risk. The legal blindness of the world allowed cruelty to go unchecked. The young man recognized that the master's rage was sanctioned by law, that the overseer's actions were protected by law, that the structures around him were designed to make hope seem distant. Yet in this knowledge lay a strategy. By understanding the mechanisms of oppression, one could find ways to move within them, to bend them, to claim moments of power that the law could not anticipate. The plantation was a microcosm of this larger system. Every punishment, every order, every inspection a reminder that law and injustice were inseparable. The young man watched, learned, calculated, the weight of structural oppression pressing on every shoulder, shaping every choice. And yet, in this landscape of legal blindness, he discovered the subtle spaces where courage, patience, and skill could create openings, a world where survival required understanding not just the bodies around him, but the laws that governed them. And in that understanding, the seeds of possibility began to take root. The story began quietly at first, whispered from cabin to cabin, carried in hushed tones through the tobacco fields, the kitchens, and the barns. The young man's act of sewing the master's lips shut became more than a tale of defiance. It became a symbol, a spark that traveled faster than anyone could control. The enslaved on the plantation shared it carefully, each retelling adding layers, small embellishments, a gesture here, a look there. The tension of that night stretched into legend. The master's rage and impotence became central. The fear he had once commanded was now replaced by a wary uncertainty. The story grew like fire in dry grass, spreading beyond the plantation boundaries, reaching neighboring estates, crossing fences, carried by those who worked the fields, by those who traveled with baskets and tools. The young man, who had once moved silently among the tobacco rows, became a figure whose name inspired both caution and hope. The enslaved spoke of him not just as a man but as an idea, the idea that power could be challenged, that silence could speak louder than the lash, that a single act could ripple outward and unsettle the foundations of authority. The story became a shield and a sword, a way to inspire courage while remaining hidden. Those who heard it leaned in, eyes wide, hearts quickened, imagining themselves in his place. The myth painted him as fearless, meticulous, unstoppable, a shadow moving in the night, his calmness in the face of danger, a lesson in patience and cunning. Children repeated the tale in whispers as they worked. Women shared it in the kitchens, men in the fields, each telling infused with reverence. The young man's presence was felt even when he was not near. The plantation itself seemed alive with the tension of the story. The master moved differently. The overseers watched more closely. Their own unease, a reflection of the shift in power that the story represented. Across neighboring estates, the tale reached the ears of those who had never seen him, yet their imaginations painted vivid pictures of the act. The narrative grew in scope and in detail. The young man became more than flesh and bone. He became the embodiment of defiance, a living warning to tyrants, and a promise to the oppressed. The story's mythic quality allowed it to survive the scrutiny of law, the cruelty of masters, the passage of seasons. The young man himself walked among the fields, aware of the reverent eyes upon him, understanding that the legend served a purpose beyond any personal desire. It was a beacon, a reminder that courage could exist even in the darkest circumstances, that even a single act of resistance could resonate through hearts and minds, shaping behaviors, influencing choices. The legend of the young man grew in power. In subtle ways it altered interactions. The whispered stories taught patience, observation, and the importance of timing, of strategy, of knowing when to act and when to wait. The story was no longer just about him. It was about the possibility that any enslaved person could carry a spark of rebellion, that silence and skill could overturn fear, that the structures of control were not unbreakable. As the myth spread, it carried lessons, hope, and caution intertwined. The young man became both symbol and guide, a quiet force moving through the shadows. The plantation and neighboring estates felt the weight of the story, the fear and reverence it inspired, changing the rhythm of work. the gaze of masters, and the conversations held in secret, the legend of defiance grew steadily, becoming a thread woven into the lives of the enslaved, a living testament to the power of courage, skill, and careful planning. The act of sewing the master's lips shut carried a weight that went far beyond the physical. It was more than a gesture of vengeance or rebellion. It was a statement, a reversal of control that illuminated the complex dynamics of power on the plantation. The young man understood in that moment that speech itself had been a tool of domination, a way to command, to intimidate, to assert ownership over bodies and minds, and by silencing the master, even temporarily, he reclaimed a measure of that power. The paradox was clear. The act of enforced silence became a liberation, not for the master, who writhed and fumed, but for the one who had enacted it. The young man, in the careful, precise movements of his hands, felt the enormity of what he had done, each stitch a reclaiming of agency, each pull of thread a subtle rewriting of the rules that had long governed his life. The plantation, for all its hierarchy and violence, had always depended on the performance of fear, on the unquestioned obedience of the enslaved. The master's voice had been a weapon, capable of shaping bodies, bending wills, and controlling movements. But once that voice was silenced, even for a moment, the illusion of absolute authority fractured. The young man recognized that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, it was the ability to act in ways that were deliberate, purposeful, and unseen. His knowledge of needle and thread became a means to assert identity, a secret language, a form of communication that required no words but spoke volumes. The paradox of the moment resonated with the enslaved community. Those who had witnessed the aftermath understood that silence could be as potent as speech, as dangerous as a lash, as transformative as a revolt. The act demonstrated that even in bondage, one could find ways to reclaim dignity, to assert presence, and to influence the world without inviting immediate reprisal. The young man felt the weight of this understanding, that power was not always visible, that control could be inverted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, that silence could carry intention, meaning, and consequence. Beyond the immediate moment, the act was symbolic, teaching lessons about patience, courage, and the careful orchestration of resistance. It was a reminder that the structures of oppression depended on assumptions of compliance. And when those assumptions were challenged, even silently, the world could shift. In the quiet hours after the act, the young man contemplated the significance of his hands, the thread, the stitches, the rhythm of sewing that mirrored the rhythm of his thoughts. He realized that power did not always reside in the strongest, the loudest, or the most violent. Sometimes it resided in skill, in observation, in the ability to act deliberately and without hesitation. As the master struggled, the young man felt a clarity, a focus, a sense that in silence there was truth. In restraint there was strategy, in hidden acts there was freedom. And in this paradox, he discovered a lesson that would carry him, and those who heard the story, through the days, the seasons, and the long, oppressive years to come. The act of sewing lips shut became a metaphor, a living demonstration that even in the deepest darkness, agency could be claimed, dignity preserved, and courage expressed. And in that stillness, in that enforced silence, a new kind of power emerged, quiet but undeniable, shaping the spirit of all who witnessed, all who heard, all who remembered. The days following the act were heavy with tension, the air thick and oppressive across the plantation. The master's fury simmered just beneath the surface, his pride wounded and his control undermined. Every movement he made was sharp, every glance a warning. His voice, though temporarily stifled, carried through gestures, through orders barked at overseers, through the tremor in his hands. He summoned those who worked closest to him, demanded explanations, sought a culprit. His paranoia spread like smoke, infecting the overseers, who in turn watched the enslaved with sharper eyes. Whispered accusations and fearful glances traveled through the fields and cabins. The young man moved quietly among them, aware of the scrutiny, aware that any misstep could cost more than freedom. It could cost life. The enslaved community held its breath, hearts beating in unison. Every creak of the wagon wheels, every shuffle of feet across dirt, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. The tension was palpable. The master's attempts at retaliation took many forms: verbal threats, increased labor, tighter restrictions, curfews imposed on those who had once moved freely between tasks. Yet each act of aggression only reinforced the careful network of observation. The young man watched, he learned. He measured the moods, the timing, the patience required. He understood that the master's anger was both a weapon and a vulnerability, that it could be anticipated and used strategically. Investigations began. Overseers questioned the enslaved, watched their faces, looked for signs of guilt, for hesitation, for secret glances. The young man's presence was always cautious, his hands steady, his expressions neutral. He had learned the language of concealment, of silence, of appearing compliant while holding knowledge that was dangerous. The community braced for violence, huddled together in small groups, shared glances, exchanged coded words, each day a delicate balance between survival and defiance. Rumors of punishment and retribution traveled faster than the truth. The young man's legend gave them courage, but it also painted targets on shoulders. Every step outside a cabin was measured, every conversation held in half-whispers. The master's attempts to restore control were increasingly frantic, his gestures exaggerated, his orders repeated with intensity. The enslaved felt the weight of eyes everywhere. The fields seemed smaller, the nights longer, the shadows deeper. Yet in that tension, a quiet resilience emerged. The young man's skill, his patience, his careful planning became a stabilizing force. The community looked to him, consciously or unconsciously, understanding that the threads of their collective safety depended on observation, on timing, on subtlety. The threat of violence shaped every action, yet did not extinguish the spirit. Each day passed with heightened awareness. Each night carried the echo of fear and vigilance. The master's power, though brutal and immediate, was not absolute. It was contingent on obedience. And where obedience faltered, where fear was tempered by strategy, cracks appeared. The young man sensed them, watched for them, waited for moments when control wavered, when intimidation failed to achieve its end. The shadows of retribution loomed over the plantation, dark and persistent. Yet in those same shadows, the possibility of resistance persisted. The community learned to navigate the peril, to protect themselves, to read the signs, to anticipate the consequences of action and inaction. And in this delicate, dangerous balance, life continued, a rhythm of vigilance, of fear, of cautious hope. The master's rage was a constant presence, but it no longer defined the boundaries of possibility. The young man understood that survival was intertwined with strategy, with silence, with the careful, deliberate management of each moment. And in those shadows of retribution, the seeds of future defiance quietly took root. The cotton fields stretched endlessly beneath the hot Virginia sun, their whiteness bright against the dark soil. Yet the young man's mind often wandered to earlier times, to moments that seemed small and insignificant yet had shaped him. He remembered the creak of the cabin door when he was a boy, the smell of the hearth smoke curling through the wooden beams, the quiet conversations in the night when elders shared stories of distant ancestors, of people who had resisted in ways that were subtle but powerful, the gentle encouragement of his mother as she showed him how to mend torn clothes, to repair shoes, to transform scraps of fabric into something useful. Each stitch a lesson in patience and care. He remembered learning to observe, to notice the patterns of the overseer's footsteps, the timing of the master's inspections, the way whispers traveled from one cabin to another, a secret language that could save a life or convey hope. The memory of small acts of defiance came vividly to him, the secret exchange of food, the quiet support given to someone punished unfairly, the careful timing of movements to avoid notice. He remembered the first time he had sewn with intent, not simply to repair, but to create, to shape, to control. The thread and needle had become extensions of his hands and mind, a source of empowerment in a world designed to strip power away. He recalled the feeling of the warm sun on his back as he bent over his work, the sound of his own breathing mingling with the soft rustle of the cotton leaves, the distant calls of birds, the way the wind carried both danger and possibility. He remembered the small victories, the first successful repair that earned him a nod of recognition from those around him, the subtle reassurance that skill could be a shield, a tool, a quiet rebellion, and he remembered the voices of friends and fellow workers, their laughter under their breaths, their coded songs, their careful glances that said more than words ever could. Each memory a thread weaving into the fabric of who he had become. He recalled moments of fear as well, the lash of a whip, the sudden anger of the master, the sense of vulnerability that accompanied each mistake, each misstep. Yet even in those moments, he remembered the resilience that had grown inside him, the determination to endure, to observe, to act when the moment demanded it. These memories were alive, shaping his actions, informing his courage, guiding his hands as they had later, in the dark hours when he had stitched the master's lips. The recollections of laughter, of whispered secrets, of careful observation, of patient craft, of subtle defiance, all converged, forming a foundation of strength. He understood that the man he had become was not born in a single act, but in countless small moments, in the cotton fields, in the cabins, in the quiet resistance of daily survival. The young man felt the weight and the gift of memory, each recollection a reminder of where he had come from, of the skills he had honed, of the courage he had nurtured. And as he worked in the fields, the cotton brushing against his skin, he carried these memories like invisible armor, like a map of survival, like a testament to the quiet, persistent power of a life lived with awareness, resilience, and unspoken defiance. The night was heavy with the scent of earth and sweat, the plantation quiet except for the distant groan of timber and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. The young man sat alone beneath the low-hanging limbs of an old oak, the weight of what he had done pressing against his chest. He remembered the moment when he had taken the needle and thread, when he had decided that silence could be a weapon, that a single act could shift the balance of fear and power in a place designed to crush both. He thought about the moral cost, about the lines crossed and the rules broken. He considered the violence that had seemed necessary, the justice he sought in a world that offered none. He wondered if survival could ever justify such an act, if ethics were simply luxuries for those who were free. He remembered the countless days of toil, the lash of the whip, the grinding labor in the fields, the constant reminder that his body and his spirit were not his own, and he reflected on how silence had become a language, a means of asserting power where speech was forbidden, where every word carried risk, where every plea could provoke punishment. He thought about the master's cruelty, the arbitrary punishments, the capricious anger, and he realized that the very tools of oppression could be turned against their wielder. Yet even in that understanding, doubt lingered, a shadow that questioned whether any act of defiance could escape the moral cost. He remembered the faces of his fellow enslaved, their whispered gratitude, their cautious glances, their fear mingled with awe, and he realized that his choice had not only altered the master but had shifted the social dynamics among them. He considered the nature of power itself, how it could be taken, wielded and resisted, how control over speech could control thought, and how breaking that control could ripple through a community. He thought about the philosophical questions that had no easy answers, about whether rebellion could ever be fully justified in a world built on oppression, about whether one could act for justice without becoming complicit in violence. He weighed the cost of action against the cost of silence, understanding that both carried consequences. He reflected on the broader truths, that oppression always demands a response, that survival is not merely about life, but about dignity, that speech is freedom, and silence can be power, yet even power carries responsibility. He considered the threads of choice woven through every decision, the way a single act could reshape futures, and he knew that the plantation, with its fields and cabins, its hidden corners and creaking doors, would never be the same. He understood that the price of rebellion was not measured in immediate triumph, but in the enduring struggle between ethics and necessity, justice and vengeance, life and spirit. And as the young man sat beneath the oak, feeling the earth beneath him and the night pressing in, he realized that the true weight he carried was not just the act itself, but the knowledge that freedom and morality, courage and consequence were forever entwined, that the choices made in darkness would echo in the lives of all who followed, and that silence, once imposed, could speak louder than any words ever could. The story of that night did not end with the first sunrise. It traveled in whispers through the cabins and the fields, carried by those who had witnessed, carried by those who had heard in secret. It became part of the rhythm of life, a thread woven into the fabric of memory that stretched across the plantation and beyond. Mothers spoke of it quietly to children as they worked beside the cotton and tobacco. Grandmothers recounted it in the hush of evening, the tale of a young man who had taken the master's voice and turned it into a weapon of justice. They did not speak of it with pride alone, for fear still lingered, for punishment still threatened. But the story itself became an act of defiance, a symbol of courage that survived long after the lash and the whip had fallen silent. Over time, the tale shifted and grew, the details blurred, yet the essence remained. A record of resistance that no chain or law could erase. Travelers who passed through the region carried the story onward. It seeped into neighboring plantations, into the small towns along the Virginia roads, and even into the whispered lore of those who would never see the plantation. The act itself, sewing the lips shut, became more than a physical gesture. It became a metaphor for the power to reclaim voice, the audacity to confront injustice, the delicate balance between survival and defiance. Storytellers shaped the event with every retelling, each recounting a reminder of the price of oppression and the lengths to which the human spirit could stretch to claim autonomy. Elders used it to teach lessons of caution, resilience, and ingenuity. Children absorbed it as a beacon of possibility. That even in the darkest circumstances, action could ripple through lives and generations. As the decades passed, the story fed the broader narrative of slavery and resistance. Historians would later uncover fragments of it in journals, letters, and recollections. Oral histories preserved by families ensured that the courage of one young man was not lost to time. The story became a symbol, a marker of defiance against the machinery of control. It resonated in songs and poems, in hushed conversations and public speeches. The act of silence had spoken louder than any rebellion or riot. It echoed across time because it was intimate and personal, because it was both literal and symbolic, because it showed that resistance could be quiet yet profound, subtle yet transformative. As new generations came into the world, they learned of the young man who had turned the tools of servitude into instruments of empowerment. They learned that courage did not always roar, that sometimes it sewed its message into the fabric of life itself. The lips that had been silenced became a story that could not be silenced, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as the plantation faded into memory and history, the echo of that night persisted, traveling across time, carried in hearts and minds, whispered across fields and rivers, a reminder that even under the harshest chains, resistance finds a way, and that the legacy of one act of defiance can endure far longer than any hand that sought to contain it. The plantation lay quiet under the weight of night. The stars reflected faintly in the still waters of the creek. The cotton fields whispered with the breeze, and the cabins rested under the heavy shadows of oaks. The act of that night had left a mark far beyond flesh and thread. It had shifted the balance of fear and respect, of silence and speech. The master who had once held the power of command now felt the fragility of authority. The enslaved community moved differently, with a newfound caution, but also a subtle recognition of strength. The young man who had sewn lips shut understood the gravity of what he had done. Each stitch had been an assertion of agency, a reclaiming of control, and yet it carried with it a weight that would not lift easily. His eyes watched the fields, the river, the cabins, knowing that the act would reverberate through the lives of all who lived here. in the small moments, in the quiet corners, in the spaces where words could no longer flow freely, there was a shift. The air held it. The soil absorbed it. The memory of courage and risk became tangible. The story would travel beyond the boundaries of the plantation, through whispers, letters, recollections, carried by those who recognized its meaning. It would enter the broader tapestry of history, a reminder that oppression could never fully extinguish human dignity, that rebellion could be subtle and profound, that the human spirit could find expression even when the body and voice were constrained. In the following days and months, the master attempted to reassert control, his voice faltering, his commands met with a careful obedience layered with unease. The enslaved watched, measured, learned. The balance of power, no longer absolute, the act of silence had become a signal, a lesson that courage could take many forms, from loud defiance to quiet precision, and that history often remembers the subtle victories that reshape the lives of many. As years passed, the story endured. It was told to children under flickering lamplight. It was spoken softly among neighbors. It became a marker of resilience, of ingenuity, of moral complexity. The sewing of lips was a literal act and a symbol. A moment where one individual had transformed vulnerability into strength, oppression into agency. The plantation itself became a canvas for this story. Each field, each cabin, each path carrying the weight of memory. Historians and descendants would later reflect on the courage embedded in such acts, on the cost of survival, on the human desire for justice even in the darkest circumstances. The chains of silence imposed on one man had sparked a ripple that could not be undone. It echoed through generations, a reminder that power is never absolute, that voice can be reclaimed, that resistance endures. And as the sun rose over the Virginia fields, spilling light on the cotton and the creak, the story remained, stitched into the landscape and into the hearts of those who carried its memory. The act of rebellion, subtle and precise, had rewritten the meaning of survival, of courage, of history, leaving a legacy of strength that spoke louder than words ever could.